In topic 7.6, we're exploring the causes of World War II. Feel free to pause the video and take a moment to read over the CED curriculum for this if you would like. The essential question we're answering in topic 7.6 is what were the causes and consequences of World War II? On the screen in front of you, there's two images. First is a map of Europe, really at the height of World War II. In the purple areas, you see the areas that were constantly under Allied control, or under control of the nations and states that would become the Allies. In the dark green, you see the original Axis powers, with the light green being areas that were conquered and controlled by the Axis powers. The orange areas were areas that were allied with Germany and so were kind of de facto partners of the Axis powers. The other image is a famous piece of propaganda from British history. It encouraged their citizenry to do exactly what the sign says, keep calm and carry on during a very trying time where their will was tested to the extreme. So the CED refers to the unsustainable peace that followed World War I and leads into World War II. The political cartoon that you see on the screen in front of you illustrates that idea that out of the Versailles Treaty, you can see Hitler crawling kind of out of the aftermath of it. Remember, that involved war reparations that Germany had to pay and land concessions in their African colonies, but also in Eastern Europe, that created real resentment and also suffering among the German people, and put them in a position to be kind of easily swayed to some pretty terrible ends. There were also disputes over borders in Eastern Europe, not only among the Germans, but also, remember, the Russians had lost what they thought was territory of theirs in Eastern Europe and the Baltic region. So this really sets the stage, as it says there, for future conflict. Remember, the League of Nations lacked, first of all, membership, widespread membership among the world powers, and also any way to really enforce anything, as was exemplified by Italy's ability to invade Ethiopia and Japan's ability to invade Manchuria, both of which the League of Nations opposed and was unable to stop and lost membership and really lost power as a result of both. Lastly, the Great Depression and the general economic unrest that really the Treaty of Versailles for Germany built upon created general anxiety in a situation where competition and scarcity and suffering can lead to some pretty terrible outcomes, and again, it did. So, as we were kind of just talking about, World War I and the aftermath of it did really little to lower the tensions that had been building over Europe, really over the entire course so far. We've already talked about famines that followed World War I, particularly in Eastern Europe and through Russia, but also there was competition over resources generally, with Germany and Japan, both being states that lacked domestic resources that they desperately needed to industrialize, and also both lacking sufficient farmland to support their growing populations, or at least the perception of that. So you had this kind of building of imperialist tradition and imperialist ambition because of scarcity and because of need. And at the same time, you have the rise of totalitarian governments, as we've talked about, in Italy and Germany and the USSR, and also in Japan, we're going to learn today. This move toward totalitarianism was really the pretext to an increase in militarism generally in these states that now found themselves under more authoritarian leadership that sought to expand the influence of their now fully controlled empires. Italy is an example of this. They conquered and occupied Ethiopia before the onset of World War II, and in some ways you could see this as kind of a pretext, although it's not really directly related. I think some probably would argue that it is, but either way, that doesn't really matter. What's interesting here is to note that not only was it an example of some global conflict, not only did it further undermine the League of Nations, as I said, but it also weakened Italy and limited their ability to fully participate in World War II, and probably had a lot to do with their defeat and ultimately switching sides during the war. So it's an interesting kind of piece of history to know, and it's also interesting in the context of what we've talked about before with Italy's colonial history and their attempt to take Ethiopia, their failed attempt in the past. This was a kind of matter of national pride for them, but didn't really result in much success for them, as we're going to learn. So, for all the bad things that we can and will say about authoritarian and totalitarian systems, they are efficient, and they're efficient at mobilizing their citizens to war when they want to be. Now, the Tripartite Act actually happened after the onset of violence. That's going to happen in 1939. We're going to talk about that in the next slide. But that was really the formalization of a defensive military alliance between Germany, Italy, and Japan that was later joined by other countries, as you see there on the screen. It's not to say this is the same as the alliance issues that led to World War I, but you can see how this would be a pretext to war, especially with, as I said, really all three of these states, the three main Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan, all at this point engaging in outright war to expand their empires. Germany at this point in Poland, Italy in Ethiopia, and Japan in Korea and China. The Axis powers are those main tripartite powers, plus Finland, who ends up allied with Germany because of their war with the USSR, and Burma and Thailand, who are a part of the mix because they're allied with Japan. Spain's an interesting case in this because they were led under a dictatorship as well from 1936 through to 1975. Part of the reason they were able to stay a dictatorship that whole time is because they remained neutral in World War II, so they didn't have the same kind of consequences out of World War II. But they did provide some aid to the Axis powers, which in the context of the type of government they had, makes sense. So I kind of wanted to talk through how World War II actually gets started. And I would say the 1923 failed coup attempt by Hitler is a good place to start. And following that failed coup attempt, where he tried to take over German government and was unsuccessful in doing so, he was jailed for 8 months, but he was released for good behavior, actually, of all things. About 10 years later, I guess about 9 years later from there, he was chancellor in January of 1933. And then in March, after the Reichstag, the German parliament, was set afire, he was essentially given dictator powers under the Enabling Act. 5 years later is the famous appeasement of Hitler that you certainly have heard about by now, I would imagine. And that happened during the Munich conference. You can see on the screen here is Neville Chamberlain. He was the prime minister of the UK at the time. He's kind of become a history meme of sort as someone who appeased Hitler, who gave in to Hitler essentially and helped contribute to what would come. And that was when Germany was given the Sudetenland. That's an area basically between what was Germany and Czechoslovakia at the time. So this area was really important, mostly because of coal, but it was also a source of other resources, but coal's a good one to know. And shortly thereafter, about 6 months after he was given that, they just went ahead and took over the rest of Czechoslovakia. In 1939, so just a year later, Germany and the USSR actually entered into a secret military alliance. And not a military alliance, a secret non-aggression alliance. And they agreed in that in terms of how they would dissect Poland, and they both wanted to basically split Poland between the two states. The USSR would not admit to this for many years after the war. I think it was even into the 80s. But it was a thing that existed and really illustrates the USSR's kind of complicated role in this, because by the end, the USSR, and if you recall from the map that we saw at the start of this, the USSR was in purple, that they were in the Allies. But actually, for most of the war, they were kind of neutral, and at the start actually flirted with joining the Axis side. So in 39, they agreed to non-aggression and to split Poland, and then later on that year, they both did that. Germany invaded Poland, Britain and France declared war on Germany, USSR invaded Poland and the Baltic region, and considered, as I said, joining the Axis side. And at this point, war is on. So as you can see, war went on for a couple years. In the middle there, France surrendered because they really had no choice. And the US and USSR wouldn't join until 1941. That's when Germany had its famous strategic blunder and decided to invade Russia. That ended the pact that they had and really pushed USSR to the side of the Allies. It's also when Japan attacked the United States and brought the U.S. into World War II by the attacks on Pearl Harbor. So that was kind of the up of World War II. Now let's talk about the downside. An important date to know is June 6, 1944. That's D-Day. That's really the invasion of northwestern Europe by U.S., U.K., and Canadian forces, and French forces as well, I believe, or kind of what was left of that had been in exile in the UK. And that was really the main push toward ending the war. That was the point at which the Allies were kind of able to get the upper hand and really kind of start pushing things toward victory. Although, as you can see, it would take the best part of a year for that to actually happen. Before that, actually, the Allies had invaded Italy and taken control of Italy. There was kind of a civil war that ensued, but Mussolini was ousted from power. And in 1943, Italy was in armistice status, what was basically at peace with the Allies, and then after that was really on the Allies' side, or was occupied by the Allies. In 1945 is really when the end of World War II rather happens. So VE Day is May 8th, 1945. That's when Germany surrenders. You can see the fighting went on in the Pacific for a while, but by September of 1945, Japan had surrendered. You can see very shortly thereafter, within 2 months, the United Nations was formed. So the goal there was to replace the League of Nations with something that could possibly stop something like this from happening ever again. And when we're talking about consequences of World War II, we're going to be talking about them a lot, so I'm not going to kind of give you a list here, but the biggest one and the kind of most clear one is that it is the most deadly conflict in human history. Somewhere between 70 and 85 million people died. Up to about 3% of everyone that was alive died in this battle, or this war. You can see more than half of those, so 50 to 55 million of those deaths were civilians. That really sets this war apart. That's not been common in war, and so this really was a different kind of war. It was a different kind of total war in that regard. And beyond that death toll, of course, there was an environmental impact. Areas were completely destroyed. War can be profitable for some, but generally can be destabilizing in ways. So there were economic consequences, and of course there were social and political consequences, which will be really the subject of the rest of Unit 7 and certainly into Unit 8 as we get into the Cold War. The chart there shows you deaths. You can see the Soviet Union led, and they're obviously considered in the Allied side, but more than half of the people that died were Allied civilians.